All right, we're going to go on to our next story, which is about Pramila Jayapal. So Meet the Press has been getting some pretty interesting interviews recently. Pramila Jayapal was just on there mainly to talk about this conflict with Israel and Palestine. And I know you guys are like, oh, we're hearing about this again. But yes, like there's breaking news about this every other day, I feel like. And there were some things that Pramila Jayapal mentioned in this interview that I was kind of surprised that she said. I was surprised she said this, and I would not be surprised if they start coming for her next. There are some things I agree with. There are some things I disagree with. But let's go ahead and jump into this discussion with Pramila Jayapal on Meet the Press. Listen to this.
Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington State, who chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congresswoman Jayapal, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be with you.
It is great to have you on a very busy Sunday. So let's begin with Israel. You have called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you believe there's a non-military solution to the crisis that would neutralize the terror threat from Hamas and also bring home the hostages?
Let me just pause right there because I don't think some of you may have realized that. But Pramila Jayapal is one of the congressmen and women that has called for a ceasefire. Now, it seems to be that more people in the House are willing to say this and not as many people in the Senate, although tomorrow night I'll get into another discussion. We're going to cover the Senate about the ones that have been vocal so far to speak out and the ones that are just being cowardly as usual. But she is one of the people that has called for a ceasefire, which is interesting. That's why I said they'll probably come after her next. Let's continue.
Well, Kristen, I called for a ceasefire or at minimum a cessation of hostilities about 12 days ago. And in that time, since the beginning of this horrific war, what we have seen is now, in addition to the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, in addition to the hostages that have been taken, hundreds of hostages that have been taken by Hamas, what we are now seeing is 8,000 Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, 3,000 of whom are children.
Let me pause here for just a second. I want to give you an update on that number. It is now over 9,000, by the way. It's now over 9,000. Okay.
We've watched 120 premature babies who are likely to die without the fuel to run their incubators. And we see 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza who are going to either have to deliver their babies or die, but about 150 babies being delivered every day without food, water, or fuel. This is not a situation that is going to help either advance our long-term strategic goals of taking out Hamas, of ensuring security and peace for both Israelis and Palestinians, or frankly, our ability to hold our moral authority on the world stage by ensuring that Israel follows the international humanitarian laws, or the laws of war, as President Biden has called for.
Congresswoman.
Pausing here for a second. How do you enforce another country to follow the laws of war? How do you actually do that? Because Joe Biden has met with Netanyahu multiple times now to talk about the war and to talk about following those laws and guidelines, which the state of Israel is not doing. So how do you actually enforce that they do that? That's the question that I have. Is Joe Biden going to call for the U.S. government to pull aid from the state of Israel in order to get Netanyahu to follow the rules here in reference to war? Is he going to do that? No, he's not going to do that. So how do you actually enforce it? And this is going to lead to another piece where I'm going to bring in the UN here as well and the role of the UN, because it's one thing to come forward and say, this country did this, they're committing war crimes, there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's one thing to do that. But my question has always been, what are the next steps after that? And I've brought this up before when there have been a number of people that have actually spoken at the UN, Garland Nixon, Danny Haiphong, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Monte, they've all spoken at the UN. And I think these speeches are great. But my question always remains, what happens after that? What does the UN actually do other than declare humanitarian crisis, declare that there's a genocide happening, declare that there are war crimes? What do they actually do? We're going to get into that in just a second.
As the New York Times points out today, Hamas is actually sitting on a lot of that fuel, food, and aid that you referenced. Their headquarters is underneath that hospital there. So ultimately, they are the ones who are depriving the civilians of Gaza of all of those necessary aid items that you referenced. If there were to be a ceasefire, what's the guarantee that Hamas would abide by it, Congresswoman?
Now, you see where I'm about to prove her wrong? Ladies and gentlemen, if she can tell you, if they can tell you that they know exactly where Hamas is hiding, then doesn't that also tell you that Israel can just do a specific target and not hurt the civilians? Think about this, folks. Let's use our brains. Okay, this isn't rocket science. If that is true, what she's saying that is laid out by the New York Times, if that is the case, if they know exactly where they are, why are they not doing specific targets at that location? If they know they're underneath the hospital, destroying the hospital doesn't make them leave the underground. So if they're underneath that building and you destroyed the building and they're still underneath, you didn't destroy them. Think about this, folks. The next time that someone says this to you, push back on that and say, well, if you know where they are, why don't you just do a specific target? Why don't you just go right in there if you know where they're at? Why don't you just go? Remember, Gaza does not have a military. They don't have an army. This doesn't make any sense. You mean to tell me that the IDF, the state of Israel, is not more powerful than Hamas? Think about that, guys. Use your brain. Use your brain. Let's go on.
Well, look, Kristen, first of all, nobody has any love for Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that has deprived the Palestinian people, absolutely, of many, many things in the time of their rule. And let's not forget that the last election where Hamas was elected was 16 years ago. Half of Palestinians are children. They were not part of that. And Hamas is not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. We have to
notice what she's saying now. See, they were not saying this before, you guys. Before the mass protests started to happen, they weren't saying that Hamas is not Palestinians and Palestinians not Hamas. They were talking about it as though it was all one thing. That was something I did notice, and people were criticizing that and critiquing that. So pay attention. This part right here where she said, let me go back just a little bit.
That has deprived the Palestinian people, absolutely, of many, many things in the time of their rule. And let's not forget that the last election where Hamas was elected was 16 years ago. Half of Palestinians are children. They were not part of that. And Hamas is not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. We have to
Now more of them are coming forward, and they're actually admitting what those of us in independent media said way before they were admitting this, that the majority of people in Gaza are kids. They weren't even alive. A lot of them weren't even alive when the last election happened. Now you're noticing some of them are starting. Again, I have to tell you, I really do believe that this is because of the pressure that has come from the protest.
To be very clear about that. But humanitarian agencies have been sending aid through approved partners. And before October 7th, it was about 500 trucks per day. Now, Kristen, since the beginning of this war, we have seen less than 100 trucks delivered. Israel has stopped the fuel from coming in and being delivered by trusted partners. And Kristen, I just think we have to recognize that this is a double standard. The United States rightly called out Russia for its siege of Ukraine. rightly called out the attacks on the power infrastructure, the refusal to provide food and water and fuel to the Ukrainians. And we have to recognize that our credibility and our authority on the moral stage is greatly diminished if we do not also call out these this siege that Israel is launching on Gaza as violations of international law.
Let me pause there for a second. So what she's talking about is the humanitarian aid that has been sent to them, which, by the way, notice that she mentioned that they were sending them humanitarian aid before October 7th. And to that point, you should ask, why did they have to send them humanitarian aid before October 7th? Because the people have been deprived of food and resources because Israel controls the resources. And this is not to say that they weren't allowing food to come in before October 7th, but they were controlling what comes in and what doesn't come in. They were cutting off the electricity. Like, that didn't happen after October 7th. That has always been a constant thing for the past couple of decades, right? So listen to what she is telling you, what she's saying. She's telling you that there was already humanitarian aid being sent into Gaza prior to October 7th, which basically confirms what the UN has said before, that there is a humanitarian crisis that is happening in Gaza. And the UN made that statement before October 7th. And this is the question that people need to ask when they interview people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They need to ask them, if there wasn't so much of an issue with the people in Gaza, and if the state of Israel has been right to them and has been treating them well, then why was the U.S. sending them humanitarian aid prior to October 7th? Push back on people when they tell you this started October 7th. But the double standard there that she brought up in reference to the U.S. response in reference to Russia and Ukraine, they said Russia was depriving people of these resources, and their response to when Israel does it.
Losing credibility, and frankly, we're being isolated in the rest of the world.
Let me ask you about what some of your fellow Democrats are saying. Senator John Fetterman, a fellow progressive, said, quote, "Now is not the time to talk about a ceasefire." He added, quote, "Hamas does not want peace. They want to destroy Israel. We can talk about a ceasefire after Hamas is neutralized." Going back to that original question, how do you neutralize Hamas? What's your response to Senator Fetterman?
So let me say something here. When I talked about this the other night, first of all, stop calling John Fetterman progressive. He is not a progressive. He told you so himself. He was not a progressive when he was running for office. Stop saying that. And Pramila Jayapal should have pushed back on that. She should have said, well, John Fetterman actually is not a progressive. He said multiple times that he's not. Push back on that.
My response is that we need immediate, sustained humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. We need the bombings, and you can call it a humanitarian truce, as 140 countries said in the resolution that was passed at the United Nations. The United States was one of only 14 countries to oppose that resolution. Call it a humanitarian truce. Use that time to make sure we get the hostages out, both American hostages and Israeli hostages. Let's not forget, Kristen, that we also have 500 U.S. citizens plus their families who were told to go to southern Gaza because they were not safe in northern Gaza. That was the part that was going to be bombed. They are now at the Rafah crossing, and all these days later, 3 weeks later, they are still there. The United States has a responsibility to de-escalate the situation. We see the escalation on the northern border with Hezbollah, and I think this is the moment for us to de-escalate, to call for a cessation of hostilities, and to allow humanitarian aid through and the negotiators to work to get the hostages released.
Let me ask you about some of your comments. You have characterized Israel as a, quote, racist state. After a backlash, you clarified that you don't believe the existence of Israel is racist, but that the government engages in racist policies. Can you explain clearly, what do you mean by that, Congresswoman?
Before she explains what she means by that, this is the problem that I have with Pramila Jayapal. Every now and then she will make a statement that is actually pretty true. But as soon as she gets pushback, as he receives backlash, she will retract her statement. Pramila Jayapal, although she's a part of the Progressive Caucus, she's the one that throws a stone and then runs and hides. Like, she's totally fine being front and center as long as she doesn't get backlash. But the moment she receives backlash, she wants to go hide or cry in the corner. And that's not being a progressive. Like, when you're progressive at all times, not just when it's convenient to be progressive. Think about people who are revolutionary leaders in this country. You think about people like Malcolm X. Think about people like MLK. Think about people like Fred Hampton. You know, they weren't radical only when it was convenient to do so. They weren't radical only when they did not receive pushback, and they got a ton of pushback. But they didn't change what they believed because they got heat from people. Now, I'm not saying Pramila Jayapal has to be like Malcolm X, but right now, the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, they're supposed to be the ones that you're gonna take heat from people because you went into a corporate establishment party. So you're going to take heat, but you're supposed to be there to push these things, to push a progressive agenda, to push progressive policies, not to put these things on the table. And the moment that you get pushback, you take it off the table so that you can remain in a safe seat. Now, let this finish and I'll come back because I want you to hear what she says she means by that.
Well, Kristen, I clarified this right away, not after a backlash, within 12 hours of making the statement. I clarified that what I meant is that the existence of Israel is absolutely legitimate, and I think the world has come to see it as legitimate. However, there are racists within the Netanyahu government, and there are racist policies that Israel has been carrying out. I think it is important for us to recognize that we need to be able to criticize the policies of the Israeli government and not be called anti-Semitic. I really believe that conversation is changing in a way that is not helpful. And let me say this too, that at the end of the day, the president and the United States is absolutely responsible because we also have been the largest military backer of aid to Israel. We need to be able to question where U.S. taxpayer dollars are going and what accountability the United States has in ensuring, for example, that when the president calls for Israel to adhere to the international laws of war, that they actually are doing that. Otherwise,
pause here for just a second. Does Pramila Jayapal make these statements without the number of protests that happen across the world? No, none of them. None of them make these statements without this is what I said before about outside pressure. When people say, well, we have to do it through electoral politics. No. No, the pressure is supposed to come from the outside. It should always come from the outside. So for people who still feel like the only way to do things and push things is to have these progressives going through the Democratic Party, this is a perfect example, what I just showed you, what has been happening over the past couple of weeks, the protests that continue to increase. There's going to be another huge one, November 4th, which is this Saturday in DC. That's what you have to put the pressure on the politicians. If everybody would have just stayed at home, and let's say those protests wouldn't have happened, does Pramila Jayapal have this conversation in the same context that she's having it right now? Probably not. She's been pushed to do so. She's been pushed by her constituents. Let's continue, because let's keep it real. Because for the longest time, the only person that was still fighting on this issue was Rashida Tlaib, and a lot of times she was standing by her damn self.
As we are complicit in a way that almost no other country in the world is.
Congresswoman, let me ask you about some developments surrounding President Biden this week. One, we spoke to leaders in Michigan who said they were concerned that he is losing support among Arab and Palestinian citizens there because of his full-throated support in Israel. That also came against the backdrop of Congressman Dean Phillips announcing he is running against President Biden. Are you concerned that in a general election, both of these things could weaken President Biden's chances?
Well, let me say, Kristen, that I have been one of President Biden's biggest supporters. I have been proud to be a partner as he has been courageous and strong on the domestic front. He has really called out the injustices for average working Americans across this country.
But is he going to be weakened, Congresswoman, with this?
Workers.
Will he be weakened
well, I
with
feel
this?
like
This is how she saves her seat. She got to make sure she says something positive in there about Joe Biden. This is how she saves her seat. This is how she prevents, AIPAC and other PACs going after her to try to primary challenge someone against her to get her out of that seat. This is what they do. This is what, I think Joe Biden has been doing. Professional ass kisser. Professional. Here comes the ass kissing.
I need to say this because what I think is that the president needs to be just as courageous on this issue so that we keep the unity within our country for the support of the incredible things he has done. He is, I think, going to be challenged to explain an issue of this moral significance to people. The American people are actually quite far away from where the president and even Congress, the majority of Congress, has been on Israel and Gaza. They support the right for Israel to defend itself, to exist, but they do not support a war crime exchanged for another war crime. And I think the president has to be careful about that. And I would call him, because I know him well, I've had breakfast with him, I've had the honor of working with him, I would call him to bring us to a higher place, to let the American people, to really call to the American people on a moral issue of this nature. And then I think we can go forward and talk about the incredible things that he has done. But I am certainly concerned about his approach to this. And listen, my colleague Dean Phillips, everyone's got the right to run, but I'm sorry, I have no idea what he is running on that is different from what President Biden is running on. He took the same bold stances that President Biden has taken in this country on domestic issues, and I really don't see what he's doing. That's not the point for me. The point is, I want President Biden to be the next president, and he needs to call us to a higher moral place.
All right.
You know what? Pramila Jayapal reminds me of like the student that, no, I ain't gonna say it. No, I'll say it. She reminds me, there's different types of students, right? So there's different types of students, right? Some people say you'll have like the class clown, and there's the student that always sleeps in class, like that kind of thing. There's like the teacher's pet, that kind of thing. Pramila Jayapal reminds me of the student that will tell her friend / classmate, oh, you most definitely should. You most definitely should like push back on Professor so-and-so. You're totally right. You deserved an A on this paper. She'll push it. And then the moment the student is not around, she'll go kiss the professor's ass and make herself look good and say, I told her it wasn't a good idea for her to approach you like that. That's the kind of students that Pramila Jayapal reminds me of. Every now and then she'll say a couple good things, but like I said, the moment she receives any type of pressure and pushback, she tries to walk her statements back, and she makes sure to come in and save herself. Now, here's the thing. How do the American people feel in reference to this war in Israel? Now, Glenn Greenwald posted this poll here. Yet another example where the majority view of Americans in every political group diverges wildly from the consensus bipartisan view of DC elites. A large majority of Americans favor a policy calling for a ceasefire, which DC elites not only reject, but declare to be taboo. And I want you to look at this poll. Should the U.S. call for a ceasefire? 66% agree. 80% of Democrats agree. 57% of independents agree. And 56% of Republicans agree. the majority across political parties agree we should call for a ceasefire, and the majority of people polled agree we should call for a ceasefire. The problem is the representatives that actually do not represent us, but they're supposed to, they don't actually listen to what we want. We have no say so in reference to how our tax dollars are spent. And I think that we should. I think that when the House decides to pass a budget, when they do the budget passing every year, I honestly think the American people should be able to vote. We should have a say so in whether or not our tax dollars are being used to international conflicts abroad. It's our money. How do we not have any say? Think about this, people. How is this even allowed? It's our money. It never made any sense to me. Oh, Lana said, LOL, you mean Two-Face? Yeah, that's exactly what she reminds me of. She's probably that student. I'll tell you. Now, this is important because other countries are starting to back away. And that includes Bolivia. Now, Bolivia, they have decided to end relations with Israel. And just give it a matter of time, guys, before other countries jump on board with this as well. Now, this is coming from Bolivia. Listen to this.
Estamos remitiendo esta comunicación oficial al Estado de Israel, en la cual, como se ha manifestado, hacemos conocer nuestra decisión como Estado plurinacional de Bolivia de romper relaciones diplomáticas con Israel. Asimismo, exigimos el cese de los ataques en la Franja de Gaza, que ya han provocado hasta ahora miles de víctimas fatales.
I'm sorry, I forgot this doesn't have captions. I'll just read it for you. It says, we are sending this official communication to the state of Israel, in which, as stated, we make known our decision as the plurinational state of Bolivia to break diplomatic relations with Israel. You see what's happening, folks? Now, I want to show you something that you may not remember. This was many years ago. But in all of this, I'm actually surprised that Joe Biden has not consulted his good friend, Barack Obama, in reference to this particular issue. He's consulted him about other issues during his presidency. And the reason why I say that is, as much as I despise and loathe Barack Obama had a different view about this issue and the Palestinians' right to self-determination than Joe Biden had. And I just want to take you back because this was many years ago. But I want to remind you what he said in reference to what should happen with Israel and the Palestinian people.
The President of the United States.
Oh, this should be fast forwarded. Here we go. He's waving. Sorry. Here we go.
Thank you. Shalom. But the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their right to justice, must also be recognized. And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own. Living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. Just as Israelis built a state in their homeland, Palestinians have a right to be a free people in their own land. The only way for Israel to endure and thrive as a Jewish and democratic state is through the realization of an independent and viable Palestine. That is true.
What's funny is that this was years ago. But if you look at the discourse on social media, and if you say what Barack Obama said then, which he also said again, some of this again in that recent statement that he had, now all of a sudden, you're a bad person.
Israelis must recognize that continued settlement activity is counterproductive to the cause of peace, and that an independent Palestine must be viable with real borders that have to be drawn. I've made the position of the United States of America clear. Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. This is not a danger that can be contained. And as president, I've said all options are on the table for achieving our objectives. America will do what we must to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran.
And look at where we are today. Now, back then, Barack Obama believed that a two-state solution was the way to go. I want to remind you, I have my criticisms about two-state solution because, like I said, there are too many settlements now for that to work. I don't think it could work now. But the other thing that I wanted to add as well is the fact that you have to remember Netanyahu didn't want a two-state solution. Even when we go back to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, there were solutions proposed. Israel rejected it. So we always have to remember this. We have to remember that there were other alternatives that were proposed. Now, this comes about a time now where even the UN is starting to have some difficulty here, because it was just announced that the director of the UN New York's office is resigning over this issue. So I want to bring this up here because this is not good news for Joe Biden. The director of the UN's New York office just resigned after 30 years at the organization over the UN's handling of the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians. The entirety of his resignation letter is a necessary read, but his first page blew me away. Again, the director of the UN New York office. Here's the letter. Dear High Commissioner, this will be my last official communication to you as director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I write at a moment of great anguish for the world, including many of our colleagues. Once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes, and the organization that we serve appears powerless to stop it. As someone who has investigated human rights in Palestine since the 1980s, lived in Gaza as a UN human rights advisor in the 1990s, and carried out several human rights missions to the country before and since, this is deeply personal to me. I also worked in these halls through the genocides against the Tutsis, Bosnian Muslims, and the Yazidi, and the Rohingya. In each case, when the dust settled on the horrors that had been perpetuated against defenseless civilian populations, it became painfully clear that we had failed in our duty to meet the imperatives of prevention of mass atrocities, of protection of the vulnerable, and of accountability for perpetrators. And so it has been with successive waves of murder and persecution against the Palestinians throughout the entire life of the UN. High Commissioner, we are failing again. As a human rights lawyer with more than 3 decades of experience in the field, I know well that the concept of genocide has often been subject to political abuse. But the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate. In Gaza, civilian homes, schools, churches, mosques, and medical institutions are wantonly attacked as thousands of civilians are massacred. In the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, homes are seized and reassigned based entirely on race. And violent settler, I think it's supposed to be pogroms. Violent settler pogroms are accompanied by Israeli military units. Across the land, apartheid rules. This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase towards the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the UK, and much of Europe are woefully complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities. That was the director of the UN New York's office, Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. He resigned. Why did he resign? This is why I feel the UN is powerless. Because as many times as the UN has called out human rights abuses, they've called out war crimes, they've called out humanitarian crisis, as many times as people that have gone to speak to the UN, nothing seems to come from it. Who does the UN answer to? And we need to start asking these questions. What is the role of the UN other than to declare a crisis? What are the next steps? What happens after you declare that crisis and the countries that you are speaking to don't comply? What do you do? The fact that this guy is stepping down, he was the director, that lets you know that the UN is not powerful. They are powerless. The UN kind of reminds me, for those of you who went to undergrad, they have these, some universities have like a legal department, right? Like, well, they have like student court, like for students. Some universities have this. But then there's like the ombudsman, and the ombudsman, like they're just supposed to be a mediation type department. And it's like, if you have any type of a conflict or an issue, whether it's with a student or a faculty member, you can go talk to the ombudsman and they will negotiate some type of meeting and all that jazz. But nothing comes from it. And the ombudsman, half the time, you got to remember, they working for the university, so they're not trying to help you. At the end of the day, the bottom line is they are going to protect the institution that they work for. So what we need to start asking is, who the hell does the UN work for? Who do they work for? Do they work for the US government? Who do they answer to? What's the point? What's the point if you have no next steps? Anyone can sit down and visit these countries and write a report based on what they saw. And they can call out these issues. But if there is no process for accountability, what good are you? We need to start asking that question.